Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Pain, Heart, and Home Healing After Loss. So this past week, I attended a funeral, and which in general are never really fun. But ever since my own profound loss, funerals have just brought on this whole new feeling when I'm there. It's a mix between, really being able to relate to the loved one's deep pain now and making sure they know how I feel them and that they know that I see them in their pain. Like I feel like I'm very like intentional about making sure like I know what this feels like, and also kind of just picturing that person who died, like now being in heaven, like with my daughter. And as you know, picturing life without this person in it now. And, that can look very different in many instances, depending on how close, I was to that person who died. And also knowing that when the funeral is over, even though I'm totally all in with that family while I'm there, unless I'm very intentional about it, I'll probably like move forward with my life because that funeral was my closure of that person's death. And so now when I go to funerals, I normally have all of these thoughts and feelings like whirling through my head, and so that's what was happening at this funeral. All of these thoughts were, coming in and out. And by the way, if you listen to my last episode about overcoming anxiety, I mentioned that all of my anxiety actually started happening when I was around 21 years old because of a series of deaths that happened in our family and a couple of close friends. And that series of deaths started with when a young girl in our youth group committed suicide, and we were the leader in that youth group, and we were all very blindsided by it. It was horrific. I was very close to the older sister of the girl who passed, so it was very close to home. It was awful. It still is awful. I think about it all the time. And so the funeral I just attended this past week was actually for the father of those girls. And he also passed very suddenly and unexpectedly. And so, of course, the family as a whole was no stranger to what a sudden passing feels like. And any death is sad and it's not fun. But this one, it just stung a little bit more than normal. And my heart hurt a little bit more than normal for the living siblings and the wife who has now lost a child and her husband. Like to some, this is a nightmare. Like, she is living most people's worst nightmare. And so while I was going through all of these thoughts sitting at this funeral, I was just picturing what this all feels like for them and going between tears and anger and fear and, all the things. I looked around and I realized that all the people in the room, except for, like probably the immediate family, they were all here to honor this man that had passed. Like, that's what funerals are for, right? They're to memorialize and honor the person that died and to offer some sort of closure to the vast majority of people who knew that person or knew of them, or were an acquaintance to them or whatever that relationship was. And of course, if you're spiritual in any way, like a lot of times the funerals are geared towards celebrating that they're now in heaven with Jesus forever and they're in better health than they've ever been and, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, like a ton of bricks while I was sitting there, I realized why most people who are grieving some sort of really profound loss or just someone very close to them usually feel so friggin' lonely in their grieving process. And like it came over me and I think my jaw literally like dropped in the middle of service as I was sitting there, and I looked around and I remembered I was like in a room full of people and I was like, all right, keep it cool. Like, and I immediately pulled out my phone and, to get like a real time response from my Instagram followers. Cause that's like that's where my people are, that's my main community right there is on Instagram. And I was like so taken back by this realization. Like, I have never thought about it like this before. And I needed to write some stuff down right away so I didn't forget. And I do that all the time, by the way. Like whenever I have a thought and I'm like, that's good. Like I pull out my phone right away, create a note, and I just write it down and I come back to it whenever I have the time to like put it into content somehow. Anyways, so I pulled out my phone and I immediately asked Instagram. You can see the picture right here in this photo. I said, I'm at a funeral. I feel like I just figured out why people feel so alone in their grieving. Like, should I do an episode on this? And the vast majority of responders said yes. So that is where the inspiration from this episode came from. And now that you have this background info, let me explain the realization I came to while sitting at this funeral. And for the sake of the picture that I'm trying to paint, I have to split people up into two categories, okay? When someone dies, all the people in their life around them will fall into one of these categories. Now, in real life, there are so many more layers and so many more categories of people. It's never this cut and dry. There's way more than this. But for the sake of this illustration I'm trying to make, we'll put everyone into two categories so that I can simplify this. So you have the really close people to the person, okay? You're talking spouse, children, maybe grandchildren if they were very close to this man. He was very close with his grandchildren. Again, siblings if they're close, parents, possibly cousins, aunts and uncles if they have a really close relationship, and very, very close friendships, like the ones that are like family members, okay? Then you have everyone else. Maybe coworkers, although a lot of people get close to their coworkers, so they might not fall into that category. But acquaintances, more distant relationships, people who, might attend a funeral, but once that funeral is over, like they kind of move forward with their life, like everybody else falls into that category. And again, I know it isn't this cut and dry in real life, but for this example, I want to keep it simple. So I'm going to call the people who are really close to that person that died, like the immediate family members and them, I'm going to call them the grievers, okay? And for everybody else, for this example, I'm going to call them the outsiders. The reason I'm calling them the outsiders is because it reflects someone on the outside looking into someone else's life. So when someone dies, there's a funeral, right? Like I mentioned before, it's usually to honor this person. We often call it a celebration of life. And it's all about how amazing and wonderful this person was. Again, if you're spiritual, we also talk about how much better of a place that this person is in. And, it's totally customary. They're often very beautiful services. So I'm not mocking this tradition in any way, but I think I discovered a huge flaw in funerals, especially for the grievers. So this funeral that I just went to was held 5 days after this person had passed. Not even a week later, this funeral was held. And before that, I'm almost positive they definitely had a wake before this, where you go and you view the body. People call it a viewing. I think we've always called it a wake. And I'm pretty sure they had another service too before this one, held at a different church. So in just 5 days, this amazing person lost his life suddenly. The family had to be notified that their life was now completely flipped upside down, top to bottom. Oftentimes family lives out of town, which I'm pretty sure they did have out of town family. So they have to get themselves in town to be close to what's going on, which includes taking off work, rearranging schedules, possibly booking flights, all of that. I'm sure they wanted to spend some time together just crying and, just being together, weeping in their sadness. They had to call and schedule the services and the wake. They had to write speeches, put together photos, print programs, probably respond to 1,000 texts and calls, I'm sure, from people offering their condolences. And then they actually had to attend these services and the wake they just planned, all in 5 days after this man had passed. Now, okay, sometimes that the funeral doesn't happen that quickly, but it's usually within a week, right? Maybe a couple weeks. Even if you made it as long as 3 weeks in between the death and the service, that is still a lot to cram into just a few weeks. And so when the funeral comes, the grievers, as I've labeled them for this example, they have all just been through an extremely chaotic and crazy whirlwind of a couple weeks. And in this instance, 5 days. And the outsiders, again, using that term for this example, I would be considered one of them in this example because, I wasn't super close to him recently. They come in to honor this person at the funeral. And they're usually coming for some sort of closure. And, a lot of times the outsiders are coming to support the family, pay their respects, and they want to honor the person's passing. It's as simple as that. So they come to the funeral. And in between the time that they found out that this person had passed and the day of the funeral, they didn't have to do all of the things that the grievers had to do. Their life doesn't feel like a whirlwind right now. The outsiders usually are viewing that funeral that's coming up as that person's final event in their own life. Like I said, they're looking towards that funeral as their closure. And so the outsiders come, as they should, and they sit and they listen to a beautiful service. Again, not mocking what funerals are objectively. A pastor will talk about all of the amazing things that this person was. He talks about how they're in such a better place now, and, they're walking with Jesus and they're in perfect health and they're not suffering anymore. And we hear, and if there were other loved ones that were lost before this person, they're now reunited. And the family tells funny and endearing stories about this person, usually making you laugh a few times. And don't get me wrong, there are usually tears and sadness of some sort at a funeral, but the overall sense of funerals, I feel like nowadays, is typically we're so sad for our loss, but we are thrilled for their gain. Especially, services that are spiritual. We turn the view, from we're sad, but they're in an amazing place. And I believe in every one of those statements I just said. Honestly, I really do. The problem then is the outsiders, they sit through the service. They are made to feel like, don't be sad, they're in a better place, So we make the service all about a celebration of their life and talk about all the happy times and the fun times that they had. And we talk about, what this person's life was and how amazing it was. And so the outsiders leave this funeral, this place of closure, with lots of positive thoughts and encouragement, because we just talked about all the joyful things this person was. Yes, someone just died, so it's always lined with sadness, but we usually are never talking about what the grievers' lives look like now. And so when that is your version of closure as an outsider, we as outsiders, we come to the funeral, we hear a cushy message of how amazing this person's life was and how they're in a better place, and we go on our merry way. That was our closure. And also as outsiders, we use that time leading up to the funeral as our time of grieving. We don't have to do all the things that the grievers did. And then use the funeral as a time of closure with that person in our life. However we knew this person or even knew of them, the funeral is like our end cap to that relationship with them. Even if it was not a close one, even if it wasn't a close relationship, that's our end cap. It's the last chapter for us with what that person was in our lives, however that looked. So we close the book at that funeral, and then we go on with our lives. And the last, thoughts or feelings we had involving this person was all they're in a great place, they're better now, and we're rejoicing because of their gain and all of these things that we hear. We left that place with a much happier perception of life without this person because of how funerals try to make us feel. And they're sad to be at, of course, but they're made to turn our focus on the celebrating part. So we leave there with that perception. Yay for them. They're not in pain anymore. They're in a better place. And that's great, which is all very true. But it's no wonder the grievers are left to feel so alone post-funeral, because they haven't even begun to start their grieving process yet. They are still fighting for their lives. Actually, they haven't even started fighting for their lives yet. Because not only that, the outsiders leave because they have found closure in how amazing this person's life was, but aren't really let in on what the lives of the grievers look like now. Like, no wonder the outsiders usually stop texting and checking in after the funeral, and the grievers leave feeling like they're thrust into a whole new world of how do I do this with no guidance and no real closure and a lot of pain. Like, no wonder the grievers usually feel like people weren't there for them. No wonder there's usually a huge misunderstanding of the pain that they're in. Because by the time the outsiders have found their closure, the grievers literally still have adrenaline pumping through their veins. Like, the grievers have barely had any time to even process through the adrenaline of what had just happened, let alone be given an appropriate amount of time to grieve anything. Because they happen so soon, funerals offer almost no real closure for the grievers and is usually the only source of closure for the outsiders. And so immediately, the grievers and the outsiders are on completely different time frames and in completely different mindsets because of the nature of the funerals and how they're so focused on what was and not on what is to come for the grievers when they step outside those doors and the adrenaline starts to wear off. It's no freaking wonder grievers feel so alone. There is an immediate disconnect right from the start of this death process, leaving the grievers feeling alone and abandoned. Because their new reality has barely just begun by the time the outsiders are looking for their closure. And when the outsiders have had time to grieve and then they get to move on with their closure at the funeral, the grievers have to go back to their new life without this person, without any real closure, and now just begin their grieving process. I know for me, like, my adrenaline didn't start wearing off until probably 8 months after my daughter had passed. And I know this because I could physically feel my body reacting to the letdown of it all. You know, I've talked about this many times, and I used lots of coping mechanism between her death and 8 months later, and it kind of was just distracting me. And yes, I was also postpartum, which offers its own, slew of symptoms, but it wasn't until about 8 months later until that adrenaline of what had happened, that initial shock really wore off. And I could finally see this new reality of mine. 8 months. Now, I'm sure everyone is different, not everyone's story is the same or the timeline is the same, but the difference between 5 days and 8 months later is a very large time frame. There's a lot of time in between there. And, we never had any sort of funeral for our daughter. And that topic in general might be controversial because she was stillborn. So she was never living outside of me. And so some people might not even expect people to consider having a funeral for a baby that wasn't even, living outside the room. But that's a different discussion. And I won't get into that right now. But, we never had a funeral or a service or anything right away because right after Layla died, I was literally making it through life 1 minute at a time some days. The thought of planning a service, I couldn't even make dinner for my own family, let alone plan an entire service for her. It was a mix between napping and crying and opening cards and writing thank you cards and more crying and weeping and like I said, physically recovering from birth. And those times were so precious to me. They were some of the hardest times in my entire life. Don't get me wrong. The pain is indescribable when I think about those. But when I think back, they're so dear to me. And I tear up every time I think of them because that's where my daughter was the star of the show, if you will. That is when it was all about her and her short little life. And that's for sure when I felt closest to her because I was literally the closest in proximity to her. And everyone was talking about her and her life and how special it was. And so those moments were so, so precious to me. And after you have lost a loved one, especially unexpectedly, those moments are so precious, and I am really a firm believer in not rushing through them. They should be cherished and gone through slowly and methodically. And then coming out of those early times, if you want to call it that, like even without having a service for her, to offer anyone any real closure, there was still, I felt like, a huge misconception of like how hard life was for me, even for some of the closest people to me. I felt like people who I thought definitely should have realized like how freaking hard this was going to be for me and should have been there for me, like really weren't there in a way that I thought they would be, because they had moved forward so much quicker than I was able to. And so I can only imagine what it would have been like if we did have a service so early on. It would have offered a lot of people close to me some closure super early on at a time where I hadn't even started to process what had happened in my life. And I think that is a huge flaw in what funerals have to offer people. I think they do a great job at honoring the person who passed and a terrible job setting the grievers up for a less painful grieving process moving forward, and a much more lonely grieving process, because they immediately start out feeling abandoned and alone in their pain because they're totally on different wavelengths. And I think funerals rush the grieving process, and they don't allow enough space for the people closest to that person to really process before everyone else quickly just moves on with their life and their closure from it. And honestly, I don't even really know what the solution would be at this point. Like, I haven't really given the solution portion that much thought. And, you could say, well, just have the funeral later. But how much later? What's appropriate? And then there's the argument like, well, that person deserves a proper goodbye right away, especially with while their body is still somewhat intact, if that's something you're taking into consideration. And so, like I said, I don't really know what the solution would be. I haven't explored down that road yet, but I have explored a lot about grieving in general, especially in loneliness. And I have my own personal experience with it. And now, being a little bit further into my journey, I can now see why in a typical situation where someone dies and there's an immediate funeral for that person, how there is a real disconnect between the grievers and the outsiders. Because they are on completely different time frames. They're in completely different mindsets before and after the funeral, and I believe that funeral can act as a wedge between the grievers and the outsiders rather than a connector of the two groups. And so while there already is this disconnect between these two groups, I feel like that early on funeral just kind of, drives it in there even further. And I am certainly not suggesting that the random acquaintance of this person who died and the wife of the person who died have the same responsibility, or that it's even the outsider's job to feel exactly what the grievers are feeling. Like, I am certainly not saying that. And even if we came up with the perfect solution to this problem, that the outsiders and grievers will ever be feeling the same thing or grieving the same way, or even in the exact same time frame. I'm certainly not saying that, but the whole point of this episode is to acknowledge why grievers feel so alone. And I think when you break down this process of scheduling a service so quickly after someone's death, when you're fighting for your life and you're in like a whirlwind of a process and you haven't even begun to, really process what had happened, like, you can see why it would potentially divide these groups of people, giving the outsiders a form of closure that allows them to move forward with their life, when the grievers are left to figure it out for themselves. And I think that's something that is often missed and overlooked by many. Well, I think that's all I have on this topic. I know it was a little outside of my usual scope of topics, but loneliness and grieving is huge. It's a huge issue in grief. And anything I can do to bring awareness to it, I will gladly do that. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and you were able to get something useful or helpful out of it. Remember, likes, comments, positive reviews are always super helpful as I continue to grow and spread the word on my podcast. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel that you're listening to so you're alerted of new episodes. I can't wait to chat with you again really soon. Signing off for now, your Hope Dealer, Emmy Smales.